What if one of the greatest business turnarounds in history was not actually saved by the person most people give credit to? Mention the story of Apple in the late 1990s, and almost everyone tells the same version. Steve Jobs returned. He unveiled the colorful iMac. He inspired employees again. And Apple was rescued. It is a powerful story. It is also an incomplete one. Because when Steve Jobs came back to Apple in late 1996, he did not return to a healthy company waiting for fresh ideas. He returned to a business that was rapidly running out of time. Revenue was falling. Losses were mounting. Confidence from investors, developers, suppliers, and even customers was fading. The company that had once defined personal computing was struggling to convince the market that it even had a future. The numbers tell just how serious the situation had become. In the first 9 months of fiscal year 1997, Apple reported that revenue had fallen by approximately 27% compared with the previous year. During the same period, the company recorded a net loss of $884 million. Credit agencies downgraded Apple's debt into speculative territory, reflecting growing doubts about whether the business could recover. Apple itself warned investors that additional losses were expected before any meaningful improvement could occur. Those are not the symptoms of a company waiting for a charismatic leader to walk through the door. They are the symptoms of a business whose economic engine has stopped working. Yet despite those realities, the popular explanation rarely changes. Steve Jobs came back, created great products, and everything changed. But that raises a much more interesting question. If leadership alone could rescue a company, why do so many businesses continue to fail even after hiring celebrated executives? History is full of founders returning to their companies without producing a miracle. Well-known chief executive officers have joined struggling businesses with impressive resumes, only to discover that reputation alone cannot reverse years of strategic mistakes. So perhaps we have been asking the wrong question. Instead of asking who saved Apple, maybe we should ask what actually changed inside Apple. What decisions allowed the company to stop losing control of its resources? What choices convinced software developers to stay? Why did investors begin believing again? And why did Apple suddenly become capable of producing products that customers actually wanted? Even one of the most famous moments in Apple's recovery deserves a closer look. In August 1997, Microsoft announced a $150 million investment in Apple while committing to continue developing Microsoft Office for the Macintosh platform. Many people remember the dramatic image of Bill Gates appearing on a giant screen beside Steve Jobs during the announcement. Few remember that the investment itself represented only one part of a much broader agreement involving software support, patent cooperation, and confidence in Apple's future ecosystem. That difference matters, because if one investment, one product, or one individual could truly explain Apple's survival, the story would be remarkably simple. Business reality is rarely that simple. The deeper we examine Apple's recovery, the more it begins to look less like a moment of inspiration and more like a series of disciplined business decisions that changed how the entire company operated. And if that is true, then the real reason Apple survived may have very little to do with the story that most people remember today. To understand why Apple was collapsing, it is not enough to look at the products people remember. It is necessary to look at the business Apple had become. By the middle of the 1990s, the personal computer industry had changed dramatically. Microsoft Windows had become the dominant software platform. Manufacturers such as Compaq, Delgate, and many others were building machines around standardized components, competing aggressively on price, production scale, and distribution efficiency. The economics of the industry increasingly rewarded companies that could manufacture faster, lower costs, and spread research and development across millions of similar devices. Apple was playing a very different game. Unlike most of its competitors, Apple controlled both the hardware and the operating system. That gave the company greater control over the user experience, but it also meant Apple carried far more responsibility. Every product required dedicated engineering resources, software support, manufacturing coordination, marketing campaigns, inventory planning, and relationships with suppliers. As long as sales continued growing, that complexity could be managed. Once growth slowed, the same complexity became an enormous financial burden. Over time, Apple had expanded its product lineup into a confusing collection of desktop computers. Portable computers, consumer models, professional models, education models, and countless variations distinguished only by small technical differences. Customers often struggled to understand which machine best suited their needs. Retailers had to stock numerous configurations. Engineers had to support an expanding number of products that frequently competed with one another for the same internal resources. Every additional product created another forecasting problem. Unlike software, physical computers cannot be produced instantly after demand appears. Manufacturers must purchase processors, memory chips, storage devices, displays, and other components months in advance. Production schedules must be established before anyone knows exactly what customers will buy. When those forecasts are wrong, inventory becomes expensive. Unsold computers lose value quickly because technology evolves so rapidly. Components become obsolete. Prices fall. Retailers demand discounts. Manufacturers are forced to write down inventory that may have been worth much more only a few months earlier. Apple openly acknowledged these risks in its regulatory filings. The company warned that inaccurate demand forecasting could lead to excess inventory, purchase commitments for unnecessary components, product price reductions, and significant pressure on profitability. The problem extended beyond inventory. Apple's distribution network had also become increasingly complicated. Products flowed through numerous distributors, resellers, and retailers across different countries, each carrying inventory, negotiating pricing, and often receiving protections against future price reductions. Every additional layer increased both operating costs and financial exposure. At the same time, Apple faced another challenge that was even more dangerous. A computer platform is only valuable if developers continue creating software for it. As Apple's market share weakened, software companies had legitimate reasons to question whether investing in Macintosh applications still made business sense. If developers left, customers would have fewer reasons to buy Macintosh computers. If fewer customers purchased Macs, even more developers would leave. The business risk extended far beyond declining hardware sales. It threatened the long-term viability of the entire ecosystem. The acquisition of NeXT in late 1996 offered an important technological foundation for Apple's future operating system, but it did not solve these immediate commercial problems. In fact, the acquisition itself required substantial cash at a time when Apple could least afford additional financial pressure. This is why the company's situation was far more complicated than a simple shortage of innovation. Apple was operating a business whose product portfolio consumed too much capital, whose supply chain carried excessive risk, whose distribution system absorbed valuable resources, and whose software ecosystem faced growing uncertainty. Before Apple could create another iconic product, it first had to rebuild the business that would allow such a product to succeed. The turning point did not begin with a product launch. It began with subtraction. One of the first decisions made after the leadership transition was to stop treating growth as a reason to expand the business in every direction. Instead, Apple began asking a far more uncomfortable question: which parts of the company were actually worth keeping? The answer transformed almost every part of the organization. Rather than continuing to support an ever-expanding portfolio of computers, Apple dramatically simplified its product lineup. By 1998, the company had reduced what had previously been around 15 separate product families to only 3 major product groups internally. Resources that had once been scattered across dozens of competing priorities could now be concentrated on a much smaller number of products. At first glance, this looked like a product decision. Financially, it was something much larger. Every discontinued model eliminated engineering work, manufacturing complexity, supplier negotiations, inventory forecasts, marketing campaigns, technical support, and distribution planning. Instead of spreading limited capital across numerous projects with uncertain returns, Apple could now invest more heavily in products that mattered most. The same philosophy quickly extended into manufacturing. Rather than insisting on controlling every stage of production, Apple expanded the use of standardized components wherever possible and outsourced more assembly work to specialized manufacturing partners. According to the company's own annual reports, Apple also implemented supplier hubs located near manufacturing facilities, allowing components to arrive only when production actually required them. The objective was not simply to reduce costs. It was to reduce uncertainty. Fewer unique parts meant fewer purchasing mistakes. Simpler manufacturing meant shorter production cycles. Less inventory meant less capital sitting inside warehouses, losing value every month. The results became visible surprisingly quickly. According to Apple's fiscal year 1998 annual report, inventory fell from $437 million to only $78 million within a year. Even more remarkable, inventory days declined from 31 days to just 6 days. Those numbers may sound technical. In reality, they represented one of the most important changes in Apple's entire recovery. Every day that inventory remained unsold tied up cash that could not be invested elsewhere. By reducing inventory so dramatically, Apple released hundreds of millions of dollars that had previously been trapped inside unfinished business operations. The company also simplified its distribution system. Apple reduced the number of finished goods warehouses, narrowed its distributor network, and streamlined relationships with retailers. It also reduced exposure to price protection programs and product return obligations that had become increasingly expensive in a rapidly changing computer market. These decisions did not generate headlines. Customers rarely notice a company reducing warehouses. Journalists rarely celebrate fewer product variations. Yet each decision quietly strengthened Apple's financial position before any blockbuster product arrived. Another important step occurred outside Apple's own headquarters. The agreement with Microsoft is often remembered because of the $150 million investment. But the larger strategic value came from something less visible. Microsoft committed to continuing development of Microsoft Office for the Macintosh platform. For corporate customers, educational institutions, and professional users, that commitment reduced uncertainty about whether Macintosh computers would remain practical tools in the future. It also signaled to software developers that Apple still had a viable ecosystem worth supporting. Confidence, in this case, became an economic asset. Only after these structural changes had begun did Apple introduce the iMac in 1998. The colorful design immediately attracted attention, but its commercial success depended on much more than industrial design. Apple now had a simpler organization, a more focused engineering effort, a leaner supply chain, and a healthier financial structure capable of supporting a major product launch. By the third quarter of fiscal year 2000, Apple had reported 11 consecutive profitable quarters. The company had sold approximately 3.7 million iMac computers since launch and held $3.8 billion in cash and short-term investments. Seen individually, each decision appears incremental. Seen together, they begin to reveal something far more significant about how Apple rebuilt itself from the inside out. At this point, the familiar story begins to look very different. Steve Jobs was unquestionably central to Apple's recovery. He made difficult decisions that many executives would have avoided. He reestablished focus inside the company, challenged long-standing assumptions, and demanded a higher standard of execution. But the evidence suggests that his greatest contribution was not acting as a lone visionary who personally rescued Apple. His greatest contribution was designing a business that no longer depended on constant rescue. That distinction matters because leadership does not create financial results directly. Decisions do. And decisions only matter when they change how an entire organization allocates its resources. Consider what actually happened during Apple's recovery. The company did not simply release a successful computer. It dramatically reduced the number of products competing for engineering talent. It simplified manufacturing. It redesigned its supply chain. It reduced inventory risk. It streamlined distribution. It stabilized relationships with software developers. Each of these choices solved a different operational problem, but together they solved something much larger. They reduced organizational complexity. That may sound less exciting than a revolutionary product announcement. From a business perspective, however, complexity is often one of the most expensive liabilities a company can accumulate. Every additional product requires capital. Every additional supplier increases coordination. Every additional inventory decision introduces uncertainty. Every additional strategic priority competes for management attention. Eventually, complexity begins consuming the very resources needed for innovation. Apple's turnaround can therefore be understood as a gradual shift from managing more things to managing fewer things exceptionally well. Seen through that lens, reducing the product portfolio from roughly 15 product families to 3 was never simply about making purchasing easier for customers. It reduced the number of demand forecasts. It reduced component variation. It reduced manufacturing complexity. It reduced inventory exposure. It reduced internal competition for engineering resources. One decision created benefits across multiple parts of the business simultaneously. The same pattern appears throughout Apple's recovery. Outsourcing portions of manufacturing was not a retreat from capability. It allowed Apple to concentrate investment where differentiation actually existed. Standardizing components was not abandoning innovation. It prevented unnecessary capital from being trapped inside operations that customers rarely valued. Even the agreement with Microsoft becomes easier to understand from this perspective. Public attention focused on the investment itself because $150 million created an attractive headline. Strategically, however, the continued commitment to Microsoft Office may have been even more valuable. A personal computer without essential software becomes significantly less attractive to customers. Keeping Office on the Macintosh platform preserved confidence while Apple rebuilt its products and operating system. The agreement protected the ecosystem during a period when uncertainty itself had become one of Apple's greatest competitive threats. This also changes how the launch of the iMac should be interpreted. The product did not suddenly transform a dysfunctional company into a successful one overnight. Instead, it entered an organization that had already begun removing obstacles that previously prevented successful products from reaching their full potential. The product became visible evidence of changes that had already been taking place beneath the surface. Perhaps the most overlooked lesson is that none of these decisions worked in isolation. A smaller product portfolio without supply chain improvements would not have been enough. Lower inventory without ecosystem stability would not have been enough. A remarkable product without financial discipline would not have been enough. Each decision reinforced the others. The company became stronger not because one action solved every problem, but because multiple strategic choices gradually aligned around the same objective. That is why attributing Apple's recovery entirely to one individual, no matter how influential, overlooks the mechanism that actually produced sustainable results. Leadership mattered because it imposed discipline on the entire system. Once the system changed, individual products, partnerships, operations, and financial performance began reinforcing one another instead of working against each other. The real transformation was not simply that Apple started making better computers. It was that Apple rebuilt a business capable of consistently turning good decisions into lasting competitive advantage. Looking back, it becomes clear that Apple's recovery cannot be explained by any single event. Not by Steve Jobs returning, not by Microsoft's investment, not by the launch of the iMac, not even by the acquisition of NeXT. Each of those moments was important. None of them by itself was sufficient. The evidence points towards something more fundamental. Apple first changed how it made decisions before those decisions began changing its financial performance. The company stopped treating every opportunity as equally valuable. It concentrated engineering talent on fewer products. It reduced the amount of capital tied up in inventory. It simplified manufacturing instead of expanding it. It accepted partnerships where they strengthened the business rather than insisting on controlling every activity internally. It protected the software ecosystem while rebuilding the technology underneath it. Only after those changes were already underway did products like the iMac become capable of producing the commercial success that people remember today. That sequence is important. Successful products are often treated as the cause of business turnarounds. In Apple's case, they were also the consequence of a company that had already become more disciplined. This perspective also explains why so many turnaround stories are misunderstood. When observers look backward, they naturally focus on the most visible moments. A famous product launch, a celebrated chief executive officer, a dramatic keynote presentation. Those events are easy to remember because they happen in public. The difficult decisions usually happen much earlier. Reducing complexity, eliminating projects, cutting costs, reallocating capital, redesigning operations, strengthening supplier relationships, improving inventory management. Most of these actions receive little public attention because they lack the excitement of a new product announcement. Yet they often determine whether that new product will succeed once it reaches the market. Apple's own financial performance reflected that reality. The reduction in inventory released capital that could be invested elsewhere. A leaner product portfolio reduced operational friction. A more focused organization accelerated execution. Continued software support helped preserve confidence in the Macintosh platform during a critical transition period. Each decision strengthened the next one. Over time, these reinforcing improvements created a business capable of sustaining growth rather than merely surviving another quarter. Seen from this perspective, Steve Jobs deserves enormous credit, but perhaps not for the reason most people assume. His greatest achievement was not proving that one extraordinary leader can save a failing company through vision alone. His greatest achievement was creating the discipline to redesign the entire system around a clear set of priorities. Once that system existed, every important part of the business began moving in the same direction. Products supported strategy. Operations supported products. Capital supported operations. Partnerships supported the ecosystem. Execution became more consistent because the organization was no longer trying to excel at everything simultaneously. That is why Apple's recovery remains relevant far beyond the technology industry. Every struggling company eventually faces the same uncomfortable choice. Continue spreading limited resources across an increasingly complex organization, or remove enough complexity that every remaining decision becomes more powerful. Apple chose the second path. The company did not simply become better at innovation. It became better at deciding where innovation actually mattered. That difference explains why Apple's recovery was never just the story of a remarkable leader returning home. It was the story of a business that learned how strategic focus, disciplined capital allocation, and operational simplicity could transform scattered effort into lasting competitive strength. By the time Apple became the world's most valuable company, the foundation had already been built years earlier, one deliberate business decision at a time.